Who here considers themselves a leader?
I knew that to maintain my integrity as a leader,
Characteristics of leaders
I had to take responsibility.
who are thriving and what they do differently.
Welcome to the Everyday School Leadership Supported podcast series. My name is Fran Palukai, and in this series, I speak with school leaders from across Europe about a variety of topics based on research cards developed by Loes van Wessem, Rieneke Pruis, and others. These research cards function as practical tools that you can use to tackle everyday challenges within your organization. Welcome, everyone, to this podcast episode in which we are going to talk about how to ensure the child's agency. And the child's agency relates to how much autonomy the child has, how much autonomy the person has to make their own decisions, to be the person they want to be, to express themselves. And I'm joined here today by Luca and by Petra. And maybe, Luca, I already saw you nodding a little bit. Maybe you want to react already to this topic?
Yes, thank you very much. When we talk about child agency in education, what we would like to ensure is that children, as one of the main actors of the education, are not just passive participants, but they have the chance and the opportunity to influence how the education is happening, and they are able to make decisions on how the school is happening around them. So this is why child agency is such an important topic. Democracy seems to be a very popular topic in schools, but we cannot teach democracy. What we can do is show children in action how they can participate in the smaller community, and then later on, when they leave the school, this is going to be a model for them on how they can participate in society, being an active citizen.
So it's not just the consumption of the education, but it's the co-creation, doing
Yes.
it together. And then I can imagine that as a teacher or as a school, the biggest issue is that of risk. So you put the children at risk, or at least you have the perceived image that you put the children at risk when you're giving them a lot of agency. Because maybe you feel responsible, and if you give the child a lot of agency, it's going to take more risk than it maybe can take on. How would you enable a teacher, or how would you motivate them in such a way that they give the children enough risk? How do they judge that for themselves?
So I think it's a really important concept that we see is that adults tend to think that they know what is best for the children. They know better than the children do because they are small, they don't know enough about the world. However, if we don't allow the children to experiment in this safe zone, and that is why the school is so important, because there is this safety net around the children, they can make mistakes, they can make bad decisions, and they can be learning points. They are not going to have the same freedom when they leave the school or when they leave the safe environment. So this is why the teachers need to gradually give them more and more responsibility, more and more autonomy, so they have the chance to learn and to try it. So by the time they are an adult and they have the legal freedom and they have the voting right and they don't have the safety net anymore, they are already prepared and they have learned from their own mistakes and not just from cautionary tales that are obviously never going to be that effective.
Petra, as a old school head teacher, you're no longer school head teacher, but you used to be one. How do you facilitate a teacher that is maybe risk averse? Because I could imagine that there's certain teachers that are comfortable with doing this, comfortable with giving the space to the children, but I can imagine there's also teachers that want to keep more control and they maybe want to restrict more of that agency. How would you stimulate one of those teachers to give the children more agency?
I think there is a lot of difference between countries. For myself, I've been a teacher for 17 and a half years, and I know that in your system, it's easy to get along with how we have always done it. So if you want to change your pedagogies, the way you teach your children, it means that you have to change your own mindset. And in some countries, for example, in the Netherlands, where I've been working, we do know experimental education. We try to challenge children to find the next zone of development, including the risk coming with it. But there are countries who have a more strict system and top-down curricula, and teachers are just filling in the curricula as best as they can. So I think first a head teacher needs to challenge the teacher to think for themselves what they would like the children to experiment with the freedom and the agency that they actually can have. But the other thing is that they also have to reflect on themselves, their behavior, the curriculum. And the challenge of the head teacher to make people actually think about it, I think that is the first step to take. And the second, of course, is for a lot of teachers then actually taking up the change.
So if I may connect to that, what we very often do when we are training teachers is that we approach it by asking them what problems do they experience in the classroom. And very often the problems like behavioral issues or lack of interest, lack of motivation are issues that can be solved by allowing the children to make more decisions. Because, for example, if you allow the children to pick what is going to be the next topic of their certain class, you make them engaged, you make them basically buy in to this topic. And if they are also allowed to participate in group rules, then you are going to ensure that those rules are going to be also respected because they have made those rules themselves. They are going to be more engaged in the lesson because they have picked the topic themselves. So very often, if you can offer this as a solution to a problem that the teacher was not able to solve with the traditional methods, then it can be a very good way to show them why this is a life-changing impact on their teaching methods as an educational professional.
Yeah, well, actually, I agree fully with what Lucia just said. And I also see, for example, in the Netherlands, every school does it because this is the normal way of working and it is successful. But it's not everywhere the same. And also, child agency is considered different. For example, in the United Kingdom, they have assemblies, youth assemblies in the school. But the assemblies are, again, on certain topics that the teachers actually chose. And the feeling that you are doing it, or if you are actually doing it, that is a question you can really be critical on, because I agree fully to have influence on your own learning is one of the most important things, how you can grow and also feel yourself engaged. But also the assembly in your school, if you want to be a school which is influencing the environment, if you want to be an open school, it means that you can work in a garden or relate to partners outside of the school. It's a different form, but it's also a kind of agency. So I think really that a head teacher talks with the teachers about what are you doing now, what would you want, what you consider child agency, what are the children's rights, and then to reflect on how could we do it in our school in the context of our environment, because the starting point of every school is different, and that's what we have to respect.
Yeah. And earlier you mentioned also that you have to gradually get into it. You have to kind of explore how much agency you can give to a child. How would you do that? How do you know how much agency to give and where to draw the line?
Actually, I don't think it's very difficult because it's about asking the right questions. And agency, I think the dilemma is always, especially, for example, on the internet, the safety. And that's what Lucia already mentioned. The child can be in a safe environment to experiment. And that's what the teacher can do to make the environment as safe as possible to have these experiments.
And how do you do that? How do you make the environment safe?
Well, for example, you can have a virtual environment which is a safe environment, a closed environment where children can experiment before, for example, go on the real internet. You can have games or role games in what you can encounter in the real world. But because it's in a game kind setting, it's in an experimental setting with safe boundaries, everything can go wrong, and then you can learn before you actually go out in the world.
And very often, a school itself is basically a model version of society. There are different age groups, there are different interest groups, and the youth councils are one of the most popular and most common forms of child involvement in schools. However, what we see is that very often it is something that reserved for the older children, and they somehow magically forget what it was like to be a younger child, and their interests are very often completely neglected, which is very sad because research shows us that as young as 2-year-olds are already able to make group rules for themselves and they are able to respect it. So child agency and child participation can start already in the nurseries. And if these children are really allowed to exercise these rights, then by the time they become 7 or 8, they can already do so much more than what they usually have the chance to do. And for example, campaigning to be a representative of a class, or making a school radio, or making decisions on what is being served in the school cafeteria, those processes are very close to other decisions that they are going to make as adults later. But in the school, the risk is very slow. The chances of failing are maybe similar, but the consequences are much more mild. So this is really important that they get the chance to experiment and to try it there, and then later on they will have something to rely on when the stakes are much higher.
Yeah.
Low
For-
downside, high upside.
Yeah, for example, with young children, you can work with pictos. If there are certain things which could be good for the child's development to do, certain games, playing together, experimental, you can make pictures of it or design something. And you can let children actually hang them, like in hanging the laundry, like what you do on Monday, hang it on Monday. What would you do on Tuesday, hang it on Tuesday. So even children who cannot read, by the little pictures, they can make their plannings. And also the teacher can help, because sometimes the teacher can also put a planning somewhere if a child has a difficulty on choosing it, or you can let children choose together, let two children choose together what they want to do as a couple. So it's actually very easy if you think about the didactic engagement that you involve as a teacher.
It's the co-creation we also talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think it's really important what Petra has mentioned, that there is a way to engage every single child, but the teacher as a professional needs to know the right method, because we cannot expect to engage a 2-year-old and a 15-year-old in the same way. And I think very often what we see that this part is missing from teacher education, and they do not have the right skills. And even if they, in general, acknowledge the concept of child agency being important, they are lacking the appropriate training to do it in an effective way. So I think ESHA has the responsibility and the opportunity, fortunately, to support many head teachers around Europe with right materials so they can then support their teachers and thus engage children in their own decision-making processes.
So last question before we round up. Suppose we would give the children the keys to the school for a day and they can run the whole thing, and we give them the ultimate agency. What do you think they would do? What would be the decisions they make? What would they change in the education system?
Well, I can tell you a very nice story about that. I know it's happening that people give the school or the museum or the company to the children, and the children can have the roles that the adults should have. And the adults are present actually to observe what the children are doing. And in the end, almost always the adults say, wow, what the children have done. They make actually more creative and better decisions than I would have. And I think it's not the child that has learned today. I think it's me. And this is a challenge. I think if you really give them responsibilities, you might be surprised of the creativity that they have. And actually the honesty, because they look with open eyes and they do not yet have this behavior that we've learned in society. They just decide really on what they think is best. And we could learn from that.
Unfiltered, just be yourself.
Yes, I completely agree with that giving them the responsibility is not going to turn out into chaos like what a lot of teachers are afraid of, but instead they are going to approach learning from a different way. It might be louder, it might be messier, but it doesn't mean that there will be no learning, and it's probably going to be lasting much longer than something that they found boring or uninteresting. So I would encourage every school head to give the keys to the children and to let them do whatever they want and to engage them in their own learning.
Thank you. Before we close up, where can people find you online? Do you have an email, LinkedIn, webpage?
Well, any school head should approach their local school head organization and see if they are already part of the European School Heads Association. But you can find us on our website, which is www.esha.org.
So esha.org.
And there you can find us
Both
also
of you, right?
personally.
Yes. Perfect. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You can visit esha.org/headstart for more information on the research cards and the guests of this episode. This podcast was an ESHA production. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.